Hey, it's Professor Grabowski, and this video lecture will cover how to conduct interviews for your profile stories. A profile story is a story that focuses on a newsworthy person. In order to write a good profile story, you should include the following elements. First, you want to include a news peg. In other words, why is this person you're profiling newsworthy and timely? Why are you writing about them now? What's happening now or in the near future that's interesting? For example, when late night talk show hosts invite on actors to interview, they invite actors who have a new movie out. Second thing your profile story should have is information about the person's background, such as where they grew up and where they live now, their education. And by that I mean where they graduate college from or get their advanced degree from. You typically don't need to include every last detail about their education, such as where they went to high school and elementary school, unless that's somehow relevant to why you're profiling them. And then you also want to include stuff like their current occupation, if they're a student, what's their major, or if they're working, what's their job title, if they're a player, what sport do they play, what position, background details like that. The third thing your profile story should have is anecdotes and incidents involving the subject. An anecdote is a mini story. And in profiles, we use anecdotes to illustrate a point. For example, if you're writing about an athlete and you want to demonstrate that they're very hardworking, you might talk about how they, stay after each basketball practice to take 500 extra shots. So that's kind of an anecdote that illustrates what a hard worker they are. Fourth, your story should include quotes quotes from the person you're profiling that are relevant to his or her newsworthiness. Quotes are someone's exact words. Fifth, your story should include your own observations. Now, when you're making observations to include in your story, you want to avoid making opinionated statements. But for example, you might describe how an artist paints or a professor's teaching style. And finally, your profile story should contain comments or quotes from people who know the person you're interviewing. So besides interviewing the person who your story's focused on, you also want to talk to people who know them well and can provide quotes about them. For example, their teammates or coworkers or mentors, people like that. Now, in order to get all these elements I just mentioned, you need to conduct interviews. If you glance at today's newspaper or any news site, or if you listen carefully to tonight's evening newscast, you'll be hard-pressed to find a story that lacks information from an interview. Interviewing sources provides journalists with information and gives them credibility. It's one of the key ingredients that separates journalism from other forms of writing. In journalism, the primary way we get information is by talking to people. In other types of writing, for example, if you're doing a research paper for a history class, you might just look online, at library databases or do a Google Scholar search to find the information you're looking for. But in news writing, we are writing about news, and it's news because it's new. So we can't just go on Google and copy our information. That's a book report. So how do we go about finding stuff or finding information about stuff that hasn't been written about yet? Well, we have to write our stories from scratch, and we get information for our stories by interviewing people. Interviewing is one of the big things that separates journalism from other types of writing. We talk to important and interesting people who are doing things the public should know about. Now, the average person doesn't have time to talk to these people or the opportunity to access these newsworthy people. But as a journalist, you do. So journalists interview those newsworthy people and share their findings and stories that the public reads. So in this video, I will walk you through step by step on how to conduct an interview. Of course, the first thing you have to do is set up your interview. When contacting the person, what you want to do is send them an email or give them a call. Identify yourself as someone who's writing a story. State the purpose of your interview. For example, I'd like to write a profile story about you and, your award for community service that you just won. You want to make it clear that the material from this interview will possibly be used in a story that you plan to publish. You can tell them that the story is being done as part of a class assignment, but that you also intend to submit it to a newspaper to get published. Finally, tell the person you want to interview how much time it will take. If it's the person you're focusing the story on, I would say you should plan to spend an hour or more talking to them. But if it's a secondary source, like someone who knows the person you're focusing on, you might just need 10 minutes or be able to email them, your questions really quickly. You want to schedule the interview for a time that's convenient for the person, that they won't be too busy, so that they can, focus on the interview and not be distracted by a bunch of people coming in and out of their office. You want to meet the person at a place that they're comfortable, if possible. Meet them where they do their job or activity or whatever it is that you're writing about. So if you're interviewing a CEO, go to their office and interview them there. Maybe get a tour of the company. If it's a baseball player, talk to him after practice at the field. Of course, while coronavirus remains an issue, you may want to conduct your interview over video chat to protect your health and the health of the person you're writing about. And that's fine. It's better if you can meet in person, but your health and safety should come first. And, journalists often conduct interviews over video or phone. So you can definitely get this done by socially distancing. Now, whether you do your interview in person or on Zoom, you should at least do a live interview. What I mean by a live interview is talking to this person face to face. So don't email the person, don't email them your interview questions. Instead, what you want to do is conduct the interview either in person or over live video. And here's why. People will take you more seriously if your interview is face to face. It's more personal and it builds rapport. It ensures you're talking to the correct person and, not someone pretending to be someone they're not. A live interview also produces more natural responses instead of, that stilted, prepared statement you tend to receive when you email your questions. You can also ask immediate follow-up questions instead of having to play email ping pong. In addition, during a live interview, you might make a surprising discovery. The person might mention something that takes the story in a whole new direction. Finally, email and phone interviews can be very one-dimensional, right? You don't get to see the person's face and body language. But with a face-to-face interview, that does reveal the person's body language, the environment they're in, their personality, things like that, which can really add color and detail to your story. Now, before you conduct your interview, you should gather background information about the person you plan to profile. So go and research your subject online. Do a Google search and see what comes up. Also check out their social media profiles. The person might have a website or a biography on their company's website. For example, all Adelphi professors, staff, athletes, and coaches have biographies on the university's website. LinkedIn is also usually a really useful resource. A lot of people have LinkedIn profiles and they include kind of their professional information on there, such as their current job, their previous jobs, where they went to school, stuff like that. It kind of functions like an online resume. In addition, you might also ask the person to email you their resume. Now, why should you research someone before you interview them? Well, because it's a building block for a successful interview. The information you get by doing research can help you develop a tentative story idea and lead to specific questions. It can provide you with a feel for the person you're going to be writing about. It also provides useful background details. For example, You may find something interesting in the person's resume that you didn't know about. If you're interviewing a teacher, you might find that she went to private, exclusive, expensive schools all her life, but she's chosen to teach at a very poor school. Well, what inspired her to make this choice? You know, why is this rewarding for her? Or you might see that she's won awards for playing soccer in college and you didn't know that she was a former jock. So be sure to do your research before you show up for your interview. Before the interview, you also want to think about what your story angle is. What's interesting or unusual about this person? What is this person's story? So devise a tentative theme for your story. A major purpose of the interview will be to obtain quotes, anecdotes, and other evidence to support that theme. Now, it's possible that your theme may change after talking to the person, and a more interesting angle may develop. As part of the preparation for the interview, you want to make sure that you prepare a list of questions to ask before the interview takes place. Because if you just show up without any questions and expect the other person to carry the conversation, that's not going to work out too well. So, I recommend grouping your questions into categories. For example, first you might ask about basic background information, such as the person's age, where they live, their occupation, etc. And then you might ask questions related to why you're profiling this person. So if this person just wrote a book, you might ask them about the book. What's it about? Who published it? How many copies have been sold? Has it won any awards, etc.? And then you might want to explore their background, such as, well, how did they get interested in writing, and why did they decide to write this book? Finally, before you begin your interview, you want to make sure that you have the right tools assembled. In journalism, the tools you need for an interview are a notepad, so you can take notes, a pen, of course, and a tape recorder, so that you can record the interview. In addition, it's good to have a camera, so you can take a picture of the person. Your smartphone probably has a recording function and a camera. So basically what you need is a pen, a notepad to write your notes on, and a smartphone. Just make sure that your smartphone has enough storage space to record your interview. So you might have to go and clear out, some of your thousands of photos so that you don't run out of recording space in the middle of your interview. You should also, of course, test your recorder before you start the interview to make sure it's recording properly and to make sure you know how it works. And then at the interview, you should be sure to ask if it's okay to record the person for your accuracy. I wouldn't record them secretly. In some states, that's illegal. But just ask the person. Just explain that having a recording will ensure that your quotes are accurate. So that's what you want to do to prepare for an interview. Now let's cover what to do during the actual interview. When your interview begins, start with small talk. Always begin with small talk, such as, how's your day going? Or can you believe the weather we're having? Or, hey, how about that, Mets game last night? Try to develop a rapport with the subject. And once you begin the official interview, you want to start with the easy questions first to get them talking about themselves. Unless you're in a situation where you only have a few minutes to interview someone, or, you're at a press conference and you only get one question to ask, the mayor or president or someone like that, you should almost never plunge in with the tough questions at the beginning. Instead, break the ice, explain who you are, what you're doing, why you wanted to interview him or her. A touch of flattery always helps. For example, if you're interviewing an entrepreneur, you might say that, you thought their business sounded cool. Remember, try to ease into the interview. The point of an interview is to find out what is interesting about the person and to help them get comfortable talking so that they'll spill the beans and do it in an interesting, quotable, and clear way. Initially, focus on making the subject comfortable as well as getting general background information out of the way. So you can begin, like I said, by asking their age, their town of residence, education, jobs held, family information, such as if they're married or have kids. Ideally, the interview should be a give and take. Come prepared with several questions, but let a natural conversation develop. A reporter's biggest mistake is either to go into an interview with no questions or to go into an interview with a long list of questions and never deviate from the list. A good reporter begins an interview with a set of questions, but knows when to add impromptu questions that will get the subject to continue on a train of thought, if it sounds interesting. So, for example, say you ask the person, what was the goal of the fundraiser you had? And the person answers, we wanted to make the club look good. No, just kidding. Really, the goal was to earn enough money to help build a new center for migrant worker education. Well, instead of skipping to the next question, you might follow up on that first part to find out if, there was something behind it. So you might ask, well, what did you mean you wanted to make the club look good? Another important thing to do during the interview is to listen carefully. Be conversational, but let the person you're interviewing do most of the talking. So listen and watch attentively. You can nod your head to indicate that you're following along, but never supply an answer or suggest an answer. Be patient and wait for the person to respond. Now, invariably in an interview, you'll probably encounter an awkward moment of silence. Maybe you ask the question and the person pauses before answering it. Or maybe they're answering it and then all of a sudden they stop and they're kind of pondering it. You want to try to resist the temptation to ask the question again or rephrase it or interrupt them. As awkward as that moment of silence is for you sitting there, trust me, it's even more awkward for the person answering the question. And they know that you're waiting for them to answer. But I find that you often get some of the best and most interesting and candid responses after those awkward silences. So you just kind of got to bite your tongue, and wait for them to finally speak up. It may take several moments, but it will happen. During the interview, you should also observe. A good reporter spends a lot of time looking at the subject as well as the subject's surroundings. It's a good idea to interview the person in their office, classroom, or home if possible, because you'll always learn more about that person by watching them in their natural environment instead of yours. Try to notice details in the person's environment when you're doing the interview. Even if you're doing it over Zoom, try to observe their personal habits, pay attention to their appearance. For example, does the person wear a locket every day? Whose picture is inside the locket? Does the person have readily visible tattoos? If so, is there a story behind them? Do they symbolize anything? Does the person roar up to work or school or wherever on a Harley Davidson every day, or maybe drives in a Mercedes, or maybe drives a hybrid electric gas car? Does the person flinch every time she sees someone toss a bit of trash on the ground? Sometimes sources reveal themselves more in their actions than they do in what they say. So you want to observe and look for these things. A good story blends together information, quotes, anecdotes, and observations. But keep in mind, you should only include details if they're relevant. I wouldn't necessarily mention that someone wore a tie during your interview unless it's related to your story. For example, if you're writing about an eccentric professor who's known for wearing crazy and colorful ties, in that case, you might mention that, the tie he wore at the interview and describe it. Now, you're going to be gathering a lot of information during the interview. You'll be writing down what the person says and also writing down your own observations. So I recommend that you both take notes on your notepad with a pen and also record the interview. You should, take notes even if you're recording. And that's because batteries die, files get misplaced or deleted, things like that happen. So your notes will provide a backup in case something bad happens and also save you time. Otherwise you got to go and review and transcribe your entire interview, and that will take forever. If you have an hour-long interview, going back and listening to it again and transcribing it will take a very long time. So instead, what you want to do is keep notes, review them, and then figure out which quotes you want to use. And then go back and listen to the recording so you can make sure you quoted the person accurately. Now let's talk about which questions you should ask during the interview. Remember, start by gathering basic data. Ask the person you're interviewing the standard background information questions just to get the routine stuff out of the way, and get them comfortable. And then you can move on to the other, more pressing questions. You should ask open-ended questions. Avoid questions that will yield a yes or no answer. So, for example, avoid asking questions like, do you get along well with your teammates? Or what color shirt are you wearing? Instead, you want to ask open questions such as, will you tell me about how you get along with your teammates? Or why are you wearing a red shirt? Now, if the person you're interviewing doesn't seem talkative or provides mostly yes and no responses, try prodding them a little bit. For example, if you ask the person, do you like your job? And he says yes, follow up with, well, why do you like your job? If he responds, because it gives me a lot of free time, follow up with, well, what do you like to do in your free time? And why do you enjoy doing it? You want to get into the habit of asking what I call treading water questions, such as, what do you mean? Or why is that? And this is an easy way to keep the person talking. Here's some more advice on what sort of questions to ask. You want to ask the person about their experiences. You want to ask them about anecdotes. So, for example, if the person says they're a hard worker, well, ask them for an example of their work ethic. Remember to ask questions that your readers might want to ask. Now, I've posted a bunch of questions that you might ask in the assignment instructions. You can also find the questions at that link that's on the screen right now. Keep in mind, not all the questions I listed will be appropriate depending on who you're interviewing. So you'll want to tweak those questions depending on who you're interviewing. But you should also come up with your own sets of questions. That's just like a list of questions to sort of get you started thinking about the types of questions you might ask during your interview. Now, when you interview someone and they're giving you their responses, be careful not to assume anything. If you don't know what something means, well, guess what? Your readers won't know either. So if you don't understand something the person says, ask them to explain it. Underline or circle all names, ideas, terms that you're unsure of so you can double check them and ask the person, well, what does this mean? What did you mean by that? Don't be afraid to ask naive questions, and don't be reluctant to ask an embarrassing question. When you're doing your interview, also don't be afraid to explore both the good and the bad. A profile story shouldn't be a puff piece. This is journalism we're doing. It's not public relations. So you don't have an obligation to make the person you're writing about look good. They're not your client. Your profile story should be a window into the person and who they really are. So if your subject is warm and cuddly, show that. But if they're cold, arrogant, and generally unpleasant, show that too. Profiles are most interesting when they reveal their subjects as real people, warts and all. So if the person you're profiling spent time in prison or flunked out of their first college, before turning things around, don't be afraid to mention that. That's part of who they are. As journalists, we write about reality. Our profile story isn't some Disney fairy tale. Okay, so I've talked about what you should do during the interview. Now let me briefly cover a few things you want to avoid doing. First, avoid lecturing the source, the person you're interviewing, or arguing with them because, you're not a pundit or a columnist. So you need to keep your opinion to yourself, even if you disagree with them. Your job as a news writer is to be an objective observer. It's certainly okay to ask the person challenging questions, but don't get into a heated debate. Second, avoid talking to anonymous sources. Anonymous sources are rarely appropriate or necessary to use, especially in our class. I mean, it's not like you're going to be interviewing some sort of CIA agent who's revealing top secret government information to you. So if the person you interview doesn't want to speak on the record, if they don't want to give you their full name that you can publish in your story, then find someone else who's willing to talk on the record, who's willing to allow you to quote them using their full name. Lastly, avoid showing your source your story before you publish it. Otherwise, you're inviting censorship. So if the person asks why they can't see your story before you submit it, you can explain to them that it's impractical given your tight deadline and that your journalism professor prohibits it. I mean, if we had to run all of the stories we wrote by sources before we publish them, we'd never be able to get the news out. We'd be waiting forever for people to respond. Now, it's certainly okay to double check whether facts in your story, such as the person's age, where they live, to check if that's correct. You can also run your direct quotes by them. I have you quoted as saying this, is this accurate? It's totally fine to do that because we want to be accurate. But I would not show the person your complete story before it's published. Keep in mind that your story might be about that person, but it's your story and you're the one getting graded for it. After the interview ends, you want to thank the person for their time and ask them if it's okay for you to contact them again if you have any follow-up questions. You should also ask them if there's anyone else they recommend you talk to about them, and then give them a timeline for when you plan to write your story and where you hope to publish it, if you know. However, like I said, don't agree to show them your profile story before you publish it. When you leave the interview, you should reflect on the interview and try to list your main points of the story. What are the highlights? Jot down any ideas you have for writing the story. And as soon as possible, you want to rewrite your notes, retype them out so that they make sense to you. Use your recording to fill in gaps and clarify things. And it's best to do this while the interview is still fresh in your head. And then, if after reviewing your notes and going over them, you realize you're missing some information, you need to ask a follow-up question, you can contact the source again. Also, remember, you should definitely interview other people besides the person who you're profiling. Interviewing only the person you're profiling will lead to a thin and possibly misleading story. To get at the person behind the personality, good interviewers go and talk to their classmates, their teammates, coworkers, associates, coaches, teachers, mentors, bosses, and other people who know them well, both their friends and enemies. And, these other people you want to talk to, of course, make sure you get the correct spelling of their names, along with their qualifications and titles and how they know the person. Well, that's how you conduct an interview for your profile story. Now go out and set up your interviews. Once again, this has been Professor Grabowski. Thanks for watching.